In the beginning, before walls stood or roofs shed the rain, the first decision was one of place. Human families, small and cautious, looked out over the land and weighed its offerings in silence. A slope to steep risked erosion, a hollow to deep gathered standing water. A flat patch of earth with a gentle gradient was a quiet promise. Here, the runoff of storms would pass away rather than pool, and the feet of children would not slip on soaked ground. Sunlight, too, mattered. In high latitudes, a southern aspect gave warmth in the pale winter arc. In hotter regions, shadows lengthened with relief, where houses leaned toward the east, catching morning light while refusing the blaze of afternoon. To live was not only to endure weather, but to position oneself within its rhythms. What later became architecture began as an act of watching the sky and the way the light fell across soil. Close at hand, water made its own claim. Springs, riverbanks, and shallow wells marked lifelines, but they also demanded judgment. To near a floodplain, and the bounty of water carried the threat of drowning fields and homes. Too far, and the daily walk bent every chore beneath its weight. The places chosen for early houses are maps of compromise, neither reckless nor overly cautious, but measured in the balance between convenience and safety. Vegetation whispered other instructions. A clearing in woodland promised timber without shadow, but it also invited winds that cut across open ground. Bare stand of trees sheltered roofs and steadied soil with roots, but trunks too close might topple when storm or fire passed through. In these decisions, people read a forest not as scenery, but as a book of possibilities. Each tree and thicket a line of advice. Even the unseen mattered. Drainage lines beneath the surface, stones embedded in the soil, and the humus of decayed leaves shaped whether floors would remain dry or seep with damp. Over time, eyes grew practiced. To choose a home site was not a guess, but an inherited craft, carried in memory and adjusted with every failed attempt. Settlements that endured are the survivors of thousands of these judgments, where careful placement turned bare earth into dependable ground. The act of siting a house was, in truth, an act of ecological intelligence. Without surveyors or drawn maps, people still read the contours of land with patience. A hearth without a roof is only a camp. A roof without sound footing becomes ruin. The first architecture, then, was not stone or timber, but the mental map of slopes, water, light, and shelter. Each chosen place reveals less about luck than about observation sharpened by necessity. From these choices grew permanence. Once the ground felt safe beneath bare feet, the question turned to what materials might be coaxed from that same landscape, what palette the land itself provided. That transition from sighting to substance carried architecture's story into the realm of matter. Once a site had been chosen, the question shifted from Earth's slope to Earth's offerings. The palette of early builders was not an abstract set of options, but the plain inventory of what could be gathered with hands, shaped with stone tools, and carried on weary backs. Each region imposed its own vocabulary, and so architecture unfolded as a local dialect of material, In forested lands, timber stood first in line. Trees held the verticality that walls and posts required, already lifted skyward, as if halfway to being houses. Cutting them meant more than striking an axe often. It meant controlled burning, charring trunks so they could be worked with stone blades and levers. What seemed fragile in splinters became resilient when used whole. Posts sunk deep into soil, beams laid across them, bark peeled back to reduce rot. Entire villages rose in shades of pine, oak or cedar, depending on what the land offered. Across wide plains where forests thinned, grass and soil became the medium. Turf cut into blocks held moisture, knit together by root systems that gave surprising strength. Walls of sods stacked into rough squares, insulated against wind and cold, their thickness compensating for the softness of the material. In treeless steppes, communities became builders of earth itself, turning what was underfoot into both wall and roof. A sod house might look like a mound from afar, blending into the horizon, but within it carried warmth that stone could not easily match. Stone, however, dominated wherever geology allowed. In river valleys strewn with boulders, or coastal regions with cliffs, stone answered the desire for permanence. To shape it required patience, but to stack it demanded little beyond steady hands. Granite, limestone, sandstone carried its own workability, its own willingness to be chipped or split. A wall of stone was heavy, yes, but it did not shrink or warp with the seasons. Families who built with it were, in a way, making a pact with the land. This dwelling would remain when generations had gone. Elsewhere, reeds and brush stood in place of beams and blocks. Below wetlands and deltas, bundles of papyrus or cattail, lashed tightly and set upright, created walls that breathed with the wind. The same materials could be layered into mats, woven tight to shed rain or lined across frameworks as partitions. Light to carry, quick to replace, such reed houses spoke of mobility and adaptation. A shelter that acknowledged the river's shifting banks and the impermanence of its floods. Every community weighed effort against endurance. Heavy stones required hauling and coordination, but rewarded that labor with longevity. Timber demanded ongoing care, trimming rot and replacing beams, yet its warmth and flexibility made it worthwhile. Turf and reed were easy to gather but fragile, demanding regular renewal. These were not simply technical trade-offs, they were cultural choices, reflections of how a people measured time and stability. A stone house was a gesture toward permanence, a reed hut toward resilience. In the end, what stood above the chosen ground was never arbitrary. It was a dialogue between human intention and the matter at hand. Geography dictated the terms, but people learned to negotiate, to bend saplings into arches, to quarry flat stones for stacking, to weave reeds until they became walls. Each material carried not just weight but memory, for in touching wood or stone daily, families absorbed the rhythm of their landscape. From this palette of local resources, the step forward was inevitable. If a site and a material could be trusted, then the floor itself demanded care. For a house is not truly secure until its foundations are steadied weather of earth, stone, or timber. The ground would now be pressed flat, marked out, and made to serve as the quiet stage upon which all life unfolded. Once a family had marked their place and gathered the materials at hand, attention shifted downward. A shelter without a stable floor was only a pause in the landscape, vulnerable to every rainstorm and shifting season. To transform ground into dwelling, the earth itself had to be persuaded to hold steady. Foundations were less about grandeur than about patience, the slow preparation of soil so that the fragile frame above might stand. The simplest method was leveling. Bare feet tamped down loose earth, stones were cleared, and the surface was made smooth with antler picks or digging sticks. This flattened ground was enough to keep sleeping mats from tilting and hearths from spilling ash. In some places, ash itself became the leveler, scattered thickly to dry, damp patches and bind sandy soil into firmer crust. A floor so prepared was not a thing to admire, but it was serviceable, a steady surface for the ordinary weight of bodies and baskets. Elsewhere, builders raised platforms, packed earth, layered in successive courses, created mounds that lifted dwellings above wet ground. In floodplains, this was more than convenience. It was survival. A rise of even a hand's breadth could be the difference between a dry hearth and a sodden ruin. Over time, such platforms grew taller as families rebuilt and renewed their houses in the same spot. Each generation laid down new floors atop the last, until the mound itself became a memory bank, stratified with ash, clay, and broken potsherds. Long before cities, these accumulated platforms foreshadowed the layered complexity of urban life. Stone, when abundant, offered another answer. Flat slabs were set beneath posts as pads, distributing their load and preventing rot. Sometimes small rings of stones were placed in circles, a low curb that both anchored the walls and marked the threshold between outside and in. A scatter of rocks beneath a house might look casual, but each one was placed to bear weight, to steady a post, or to define a boundary. These simple stone bases, surviving long after timber has rotted away, are often the clearest signatures of vanished homes. In colder climates, floors themselves became layered systems. Rushes, grasses, and furs were spread atop earth, replaced when warm. These were more than comfort. They insulated against the chill that seeped upward from frozen ground. Some houses dug down instead of building up, half buried in soil, so that the earth itself cradled the structure. In such pit dwellings, the surrounding soil became the foundation, with only a roof line visible from a distance. Warmth, in these cases, came not from lifting above the land, but from sinking into it. Foundations were not yet abstract geometry or formal architecture. They were simply the answer to the question, how shall this place endure the weather, the weight, and the passing of years? A good floor could keep goods dry, preserve food, and anchor a hearth where families gathered night after night. A bad one meant damp sleep, spoiled grain, and collapse. Those who succeeded left traces that lasted centuries, even when the walls above had long since turned to dust. Once the ground had been steadied, eyes lifted again to the form of the shelter itself. If the floor was the stage, then walls and roofs were the actors, shaping not only space, but the daily moods of life. Bound across regions, different answers emerged. Some dug downward, others built upward. Some spread wide with timber frames, others crouched low beneath sod or stone. These were not experiments, but adaptations. The many ways humanity turned chosen ground into lived-in shelter. Prize from the leveled ground or the raised platform, the question naturally turned upward. How to frame a space that could hold warmth, shed water, and gather a family into a circle of safety. The shapes of early shelters were not inventions in the sense of sudden discovery. They were quiet negotiations with climate, material, and memory, repeated until a form seemed to belong as much to the land as to those who dwelt within it. The pit house was one of the oldest and most widespread answers. A shallow depression dug into the earth, roofed with branches and soil, provided insulation in both summer and winter. The ground itself formed part of the walls, holding a steady temperature that no thin covering of reeds or hides could equal. From the outside, such dwellings often appeared as little more than low mounds or faint hollows, modest interruptions in the landscape. Yet within, the earth's embrace softened the bite of winter and muted the clamor of wind. Life here was subterranean but secure. In wetter regions, families lifted their houses above ground. Raised huts, supported by posts or piles, stood against the threat of flood or vermin. A floor a meter above the soil kept grain stores safe from dampness and allowed air to circulate beneath. Ladder-like entrances gave a sense of enclosure, a controlled threshold where daily life began and ended. These stilted shelters echoed the rhythm of rivers and tides, their elevated silhouettes reminders that survival meant not resisting water but standing just clear of its reach. Where timber was scarce and stone plentiful, chambers took form in piled rock. Low walls of stacked boulders, roofed with slabs or corbelled inward courses, created interiors that were dim but enduring. Light filtered faintly through smoke holes or small doorways, illuminating stone walls that seemed as old as the hills themselves. In such shelters, the seasons could pass with little change. The weight of stone made a home feel permanent, almost geological, in contrast to the fragile cycles of reed or turf. Between these extremes lay countless hybrids. Wattle and daub walls rose from shallow foundations, thin branches woven together, coated with clay or mud, and left to dry into surfaces that could hold against rain. Thatched roofs arched above them, their steep pitch guiding water down into shallow trenches. In dry climates, brush shelters sufficed, airy and light, casting shade without enclosing too tightly. Form was not dictated by fashion, but by what a family needed to endure. Coolness in the desert, dryness on the floodplain, warmth in the northern forests. Each shelter type embodied more than technique. A pit house encouraged intimacy, with families pressed close in the dimness. A raised hut created separation, a small platform world distinct from the soil below. A stone chamber by its very weight, implied endurance. A dwelling meant to outlast its makers. The form of a house shaped not only the weather one felt, but the very sense of what home meant. From these varied beginnings, another question gradually emerged. Once ground, material, and form were secured, how might the load of walls and roofs be carried? The problem was no longer only to create enclosure, but to sustain it. Posts, beams, and the methods of spanning space began to carry as much significance as the shelter forms themselves. Architecture's story was moving from soil and mound toward structure and system, the quiet skeleton upon which every dwelling relied. A house was never only floor and covering. Once the ground had been leveled, and the chosen form sketched in posts or stones, the deeper question of structure arose. What held the roof in place when the wind pressed against it? What stopped walls from sagging into the soil, or beams from slipping when laden with snow? In every settlement, builders confronted the same reality. Shelter was only as enduring as its bones. The earliest solutions were simple: posts cut from trunks, driven into earth, and linked with branches or poles. A ring of uprights formed the boundary of a dwelling, while horizontal pieces bound them together. Roofs could then be laid across, their weight distributed through the frame. At first glance, these arrangements might appear haphazard, each house a loose experiment in timber and twine. Yet, taken together, they reveal a growing awareness of balance, compression, and load principles that would later be spoken of as engineering, but were then felt through hand and eyes. Posts gave a certain flexibility. They could be replaced when rot set in, shifted when a dwelling grew, or abandoned when families moved. In forests where wood was abundant, such temporary durability made sense. But in stonier lands, where timber was scarce, the emphasis shifted toward walls themselves as the carriers of weight. Stones stacked carefully, their edges chipped for better fit, bore the burden directly. These walls stood without mortar, each piece leaning on its neighbor, the whole held together by nothing more than gravity and the diligence of those who placed them. The interplay between post and wall shaped not only strength but space. Post and beam houses tended to have wider interiors, with open spans under pitched roofs. Stone chambers, by contrast, enclosed smaller rooms, the thick walls narrowing entrances and keeping light scarce. In these contrasts we glimpse how structure dictates atmosphere, whether a dwelling feels airy and flexible, or enclosed and solemn, depended less on decoration than on how weight was carried. Over time, ingenuity found ways of spanning space more boldly. Corbelled roofs, built by placing each course of stone slightly inward from the one below, gradually closed a gap overhead. From within, such structures resembled false vaults, triangular at first, then curving gently as skill improved. These were precarious in theory, yet many have endured for millennia, their stability a testament to patient placement. In corbelling, one can sense the early desire to enclose space completely, to create chambers apart from wind and weather. Wooden joinery carried a similar refinement. Instead of simply lashing poles together, builders learned to carve notches, mortices, and tenons, allowing pieces to interlock with surprising precision. These joints transferred weight more effectively and reduced reliance on bindings that might fray or rot. Where joinery thrived, houses gained longevity, surviving not just seasons but decades. In this shift from lashings to fitted joints, one sees a transition from temporary shelter to the possibility of generational homes. Each structural choice reflected more than climate or resource. It carried social meaning. A light frame lashed with fiber could be erected quickly by a small group-a-deal for mobile families or seasonal camps. A massive wall of stone required coordination, sustained effort, and a degree of permanence in settlement. The scale of construction mirrored the scale of community. Individual huts spoke of mobility, clustered houses of stability, monumental chambers of shared labor and memory. These bones of posts and stones did more than resist collapse. They created rhythm. Uprights divided interiors into bays, suggesting where mats might be spread or stores piled. Beams overhead traced patterns of shadow, subtly shaping how a room felt when light struck it at dawn or dusk. A threshold marked by heavier stones underfoot became not just support but symbol, a place where inside and outside were felt as different worlds. Structure, in other words, was already becoming architecture, not merely technical solution, but emotional stage. Climate pressed the lesson further. In windy plains, houses crouched low, their posts braced against gales. In snowy forests, beams angled steeply, shedding weight before it could break roofs apart. In warmer, wetter zones, open frameworks allowed air to pass through, preventing suffocating damp. These adjustments were not grand designs, but careful observations translated into timber and stone. The intelligence of a builder was measured by whether a house stood sound through a storm or collapsed before its time. The transition from shelter to structure also hinted at durability of another kind, memory. When a house stood long enough, it became a landmark, a place children grew up within, and later repaired for their own children. The same posts might be replaced, the same walls patched, yet the form remained, anchored in both earth and recollection. In this way, structure was not only physical but cultural. A post hole dug centuries before could dictate where new posts would stand, binding generations together through the faintest traces in soil. Even failures taught lessons. A roof that sagged revealed where beams had been undersized. A wall that tumbled marked where stones had been poorly chosen. Collapse left scars, but it also instructed. With each rebuilding, knowledge accumulated quietly, embedded not in written plans, but in the gestures of hands smoothing earth, fitting stones, or driving posts deeper. By the time villages formed, much of what we call architectural tradition had already become instinct habits of making reinforced through repetition and survival. Thus, from chosen site and gathered material, from leveled floor to raised frame, houses grew into more than shelters. They became structures with logic and pattern, their bones reflecting both necessity and intention. In them lay the seeds of future systems. posts hinting at columns, beams foreshadowing trusses, corbelled vaults anticipating arches. The path ahead would lead to ever more sophisticated means of carrying weight. But here, in these earliest choices, we find the first murmurs of architecture as a discipline. As families settled and structures matured, another question pressed itself forward: how to crown these bones with covering, to make interior truly distinct from exterior. Roofs, with their slopes, materials, and patterns, would not only keep out rain and cold, but shape the acoustics, the light, and the feeling of life within. With roofs also came interiors, insulated and defined, carrying daily rituals into spaces that felt at last enclosed. From structure to shelter, from shelter to home. The story now climbed upward toward roofing, insulation, and the inward life of rooms. The upright post and the spanning beam seem, at first, too simple to warrant much notice. A tree trunk stood upright, another trunk laid across it, and the outline of a house appeared almost without effort. Yet simplicity can conceal depth. In the history of building, few ideas proved as adaptable, as enduring, or as quietly transformative as this meeting of vertical and horizontal. A post was more than a stick set into the ground. Its placement carried consequence. Too shallow a hole, and frost might lift it free, or wind might wrench it loose. Too close to the surface, and rot would creep in where dampness lingered. The decision of how deep to dig, how to pack the soil round the base, and whether to set stone beneath as a footing, these were small acts of foresight. They determined whether a house would stand steady for years, or list uneasily within its first season. Families learned through repetition, each collapse and repair sharpening their instinct for what earth would accept and what it would not. The beam, meanwhile, did more than span distance. It distributed weight, uniting posts into a frame. A single horizontal member across two uprights created not only stability but possibility. A roof that could stretch further. A room that could remain open beneath. Once posts and beams multiplied, a rhythm emerged, bays of space, repeating like measures of music, giving structure not just to the dwelling but to daily life. In such divisions, one corner might serve as storage, another as sleeping platform, another as entry, without walls ever being needed. Where forests were plentiful, this method thrived. Straight trunks became uprights, smaller timbers laid across them formed the skeleton of the roof. In wetter climates, the posts might be raised on stones to slow decay, their bases protected from constant damp. In drier regions, the earth itself held them firm. Geography dictated nuance, but the principle remained the same. Upright strength married to spanning reach. The elegance of the post and beam frame lay in its flexibility. It could be small, enclosing a hut no larger than a single family. It could be stretched, bay upon bay, to cover the space of a gathering hall. Posts might be close together for sturdiness, or spread wider to allow openness. Beams could be lashed with fiber, pegged with wooden dowels, or carefully notched so that each piece locked into the next. No single technique ruled. Rather, the form encouraged adaptation, as if it invited experimentation in every landscape it touched. Because it was adaptable, it was portable. Families who moved seasonally could erect light frameworks, roofing them with mats, hides, or reeds, and abandon them when the time came to follow herds or harvests. Others might build heavier versions, with thicker beams and stronger joints, confident that their descendants would repair the same frame decades later. The principle remained, whether temporary or enduring, verticals grounding into soil, horizontals binding them together into a skeleton that could receive covering. This frame influenced how people thought about shelter. In stone-built chambers, walls defined space. In post and beam dwellings, space could be left fluid, its boundaries marked only by uprights and light partitions. The interior became a canvas for arrangement rather than a fixed box. Mats could be hung, fires shifted, platforms rearranged. Life inside was shaped less by immovable wall and more by the rhythms of the frame above. The openness fostered gatherings, movement, and change, qualities suited to communities still learning the balances of settled life. There was also a social resonance. Posts did not stand alone. To raise them required hands, digging holes, lifting trunks, steadying while earth was packed back in roof beam. Placed across them could not be lifted by one person. It demanded several shoulders, a moment of coordination. The very act of building reinforced cooperation. The frame, once standing, symbolized that unity each post held because all the others did, the whole structure relying on balance across its members. With time, joinery brought refinement. Instead of mere lashings, builders carved slots for beams to sit securely on posts. Pegs driven through kept them in place. More elaborate joints, such as mortise and tenon, allowed members to resist twisting and shifting. These connections lengthened the life of a house and gave interiors new possibilities, wider spans and higher roofs. Yet the principle remained recognizable, upright crosspiece, and the trust between them. As these frames grew more sophisticated, they opened paths toward monumental forms. Great halls of timber, long houses with multiple bays, shrines where beams met in high ridges all. These drew upon the same logic of post and beam. Their scale spoke of permanence and pride, but their essence was no different from the humbler huts scattered on a riverside plain. The same principle that supported a family's roof also supported the gathering places of a community. In this way, the post and beam system reveals architecture's continuity. What began as practical necessity, lifting a roof above the ground, became a tradition of structure, shaping interiors and communities alike. And while stone promised durability, timber frames promised flexibility, the ability to change, grow, and even move. That flexibility explains why, even when stone techniques matured, timber structures endured wherever forests could provide them. But not all lands offered forests. In places where trees were sparse or stunted, other systems had to shoulder the load. The logic of upright and crosspiece gave way to the weight of stone itself, balanced carefully without mortar. Dry stone walls rose where timber could not, proving that architecture's bones could be found in more than one material. As we move from beam to boulder, the story shifts toward these quieter, heavier systems walls that carried weight not through joinery, but through patient placement, one stone leaning into another until the whole stood firm. Where timber was scarce or too precious to waste, people turned instead to the abundance underfoot. Stones, common, silent, and unyielding, could be gathered, shaped, and stacked to form walls that endured without binding. This was the craft of dry stone, a system so simple that it seemed almost accidental, yet so effective that many such walls and enclosures still stand after thousands of years. The principle was straightforward. Gravity holds, if balance is carefully arranged. Large stones formed the base, their weight anchoring the structure. Smaller ones filled gaps, wedging each piece in place, preventing wobble or slide. Each stone leaned into its neighbor, so that the pressure of one side countered the pressure of the other. From this accumulation of small adjustments, a wall could rise chest high, shoulder high, or taller, a line of endurance stretching across a hillside. But what looked like a pile of rocks was, in truth, a subtle art. Builders learned to select stones not only for size but for shape, turning them until they found the fit that resisted movement. Flat surfaces were preferred for stability, but irregular forms could be tucked in to lock larger pieces. The surface of a wall revealed little of this hidden choreography. Its true strength lay in the unseen interior, where each stone pressed quietly into another, denying collapse. Dry stone had several advantages. Unlike timber, it did not rot. Unlike clay, it did not soften in rain. But it could be repaired endlessly. When a section failed, the stones could be lifted and reset, as patient as the day they were first placed. And because mortar was absent, water could seep through without freezing expansion, tearing the wall apart. In this way, dry stone structures breathed with the landscape, shifting slightly as seasons changed, but rarely breaking completely. These qualities suited the needs of early communities. Low enclosures marked out gardens or kept animals from wandering. Terraces stepped down hillsides, turning slopes into cultivable ground. The walls both retaining soil and conserving precious rainwater. House walls, thicker than mere boundaries, rose in places where stone was the most abundant local resource. A shelter built in this way felt as much a part of the land as the outcrops from which its stones had been borrowed. There was labor in such building, but it was collective labor, paced and enduring. Families might spend days gathering stones from fields, clearing them for planting, while amassing the material for walls. Children carried smaller pieces. Older hands rolled larger ones, and the placement itself demanded the judgment of those with long practice. In this way, knowledge passed not in words, but in gestures. The angle of a wrist when setting a wedge, the feel of a stone that would lock rather than slip. Stone walls also shaped the rhythm of settlement. They guided pathways, marking where one family's plot ended and another began. They suggested permanence, signaling to travelers that here was not a fleeting camp, but a place invested with labor and memory. Even when houses of lighter materials decayed, the stone outlines endured, ghost maps of vanished dwellings. Archaeologists today often trace early communities through these surviving skeletons, the stones revealing patterns that timber and fiber left no trace of. Beyond practicality, there was a quiet dignity in dry stone work. A well-built wall seemed effortless, its stones resting as though nature had placed them. Yet behind that illusion lay hours of fitting and adjusting. The finished surface carried an austere beauty, rough textures catching light, edges softened by moss, shadows deepening in crevices. Such walls aged gracefully, becoming part of the scenery rather than obstacles within it. Even roofing found solutions in stone. Massive slabs laid across low walls formed primitive ceilings. More daringly, corbelled vaults emerged, with stones placed gradually inward until they met overhead. Though crude by later standards, these innovations showed the same patient reliance on gravity and balance. A chamber enclosed entirely in stone, its corbelled roof arching overhead, offered a sense of timelessness. One could step inside and feel that the room might stand untouched for generations, its strength neither fragile nor fleeting. Dry stone demanded no writing, no tools beyond hammerstones, no material beyond what the earth freely offered. Its endurance speaks to the intelligence of hands and eyes working together, guided not by formulas but by experience. In many lands, such walls became more than practical. They became markers of identity, signatures of communities etched into hillsides and fields. From the beam's light flexibility to the stone's heavy stability, the story of structure broadened. Where forests allowed, posts and beams soared. Where rock prevailed, walls and terraces anchored life. Both systems carried weight, but each conveyed a different feeling. Timber frames spoke of openness and change, stone of endurance and rootedness, and yet the human desire to enclose greater space, to create rooms beyond the span of timber or the thickness of walls, pushed further. The next steps would attempt to stretch stone itself into roofs and chambers, corbelling, overlapping and bridging gaps in ways that hinted at the coming of the true art. To build with stone was to embrace its limitations as much as its strength. A wall might rise steadily, course upon course, until the question came, how to close the space above. Timber could span gaps, but where forests were thin, or where permanence was prized, stone itself had to carry the roof. Out of this challenge emerged the quiet ingenuity of corbelling, a technique that stretched the possibilities of stone without yet discovering the true arch. The principle was simple but profound. Each successive layer of stone projected slightly inward from the one below, narrowing the gap little by little. At last, the two sides met, creating a ceiling not of single spanning slabs, but of many stones leaning inward in patient succession. The result was a chamber enclosed entirely in masonry, its walls curving toward one another like hands drawn together. Corbelled roofs were not perfect, They placed stones in tension, something stone does not naturally favor. Yet the small increments of overlap reduced the risk of collapse, while the sheer weight of upper layers pressed the lower ones into greater stability. Builders learned to taper the interior, shaping the walls into beehive-like cones that distributed the forces more evenly. From within, such spaces felt at once sheltering and monumental, their narrow tops drawing the eye upward as if toward a distant point of light. Examples of corbelling appeared across the world, wherever stone was the dominant medium. In parts of Europe, megalithic tombs used corbelled chambers to enclose the dead, their beehive interiors still intact after millennia. In the Mediterranean, Tholos, tombs of later ages carried the method to grand scale, vast circular chambers buried beneath mounds. In the Americas, too, dry stone corbelling produced temples and shrines, their angled ceilings meeting overhead in austere geometry. The effort required was immense. To corbel a chamber demanded not only skilled placement, but abundant material. Each course had to be wide enough to support the next, meaning walls grew thick and massive, sometimes several meters across at the base. The weight itself became the guarantee of stability. To enter such a room was to feel the press of geology itself. The atmosphere hushed, as though the stones had drawn silence inward with them. Corbelling was not limited to roofs. Builders used it to span passageways, to create small niches within walls, to fashion bridges across streams. The same principal leach stone projecting slightly further inward loud openings where none could otherwise be attempted. Though crude compared to later arches, these spans transformed architecture. They proved that stone could enclose not only with vertical piles, but with intentional curves, foreshadowing the elegance yet to come. From corbelling grew experiments with trabeation and bridging, where suitable slabs of stone could be found. They were laid flat across gaps, forming primitive lintels. Such spans were heavy and limited in length, but they introduced another way of covering space. Together with corbelling, these methods formed a repertoire of spanning strategies, each adapting to local geology and need. Yet corbelled chambers were never merely technical feats. They carried symbolic weight. A roof entirely of stone suggested permanence beyond timber, a space set apart from weather and time. Bin tombs. This permanence was deeply intentional, ensuring that ancestors rested within chambers as lasting as the hills. In shrines, the beehive vault drew worshippers inward, its narrowing height focusing attention upward, where smoke or light escaped. The structure itself became part of ritual, its form inseparable from its meaning. Still, corbelling had limits. The larger the span, the greater the thickness required, until walls consumed more space than they enclosed. There was an upper bound to what overlapping stones could achieve. To go further, builders would need the true arch, a discovery that required not only shaping but a new understanding of forces. That chapter lay ahead in cultures where fire-hardened bricks or carefully cut stone, voussoirs made curved openings stable. For now, Corbelling represented the pinnacle of spanning in societies without mortars or fired clay. It was a statement of ambition, of human desire to command space more fully, where posts and beams offered openness and change, and dry stone walls offered endurance and weight. Corbelling offered enclosure, the complete withdrawal from the sky into chambers shaped by human design. The legacy of these early experiments endures. Across landscapes, low mounds hide corbelled tombs, their entrances still passable, their chambers still intact. Dry stone huts with corbelled roofs dot highland fields, serving shepherds in the same way they served ancestors centuries ago. These survivals remind us that spanning was never only about covering space. It was about asserting continuity, about creating interiors that could last longer than memory. From corbelling, the story of structure turns toward finer connections. Not only how stone could be stacked, but how wood itself could be fastened. The question was no longer only of mass and balance, but of joinery, how to bind beams, posts, and frames into structures that endured as securely as the heaviest stone wall. In this transition from piling to joining, we glimpse the quiet refinement of craft, where precision began to carry as much weight as bulk. Stone could be stacked, corbelled, or spanned, but timber required a subtler art. Wood, unlike rock, was fibrous, elastic, and alive with grain. It could not simply be piled. It had to be persuaded, shaped, and bound. The earliest frames were tied together with whatever fibers lay at hand-twisted sinew, bark strips, or lengths of cord. These lashings worked well enough for temporary shelters, but time revealed their weakness. Fibers frayed, sinew dried and cracked, and joints loosened with each season's swelling and shrinking of wood. The answer was not to abandon timber, but to learn its nature more deeply. Builders discovered that wood could be shaped to meet wood. A post could be notched so that a beam rested securely upon it. A peg could be carved and driven through two members, locking them without rope. Slots, grooves, and tenons carved from the same material as the frame itself created bonds, far stronger than any cord. In these first joints, we see the beginnings of carpentry as an art distinct from mere construction. The simplest joint was the lap, where one piece overlapped another and was secured by pressure or pegging. Stronger still was the mortise and tenon, a protruding tongue on one member fitted precisely into a cavity on another. These unions relied not on external bindings, but on the integrity of the wood itself, the grain resisting separation. Once mastered, such joinery transformed buildings. Frames stood firmer, roofs spanned wider, and structures endured not years but generations. Fastenings varied with culture and resource. In some lands, wooden pegs sufficed, whittled from harder species than the beams they secured. In others, early metal pins or clamps made their appearance, where smelting had reached. But always the principle was the same: connection through precision, not through chance. To cut a joint well demanded foresight and patience, for a misjudged angle could weaken the whole. The craft lay as much in restraint as in force. These joints did more than hold. They taught builders to think of structures as systems, each piece contributing to a whole. A post was not an isolated element, but part of a rhythm, balanced by beams and braced by diagonals. A roof frame could be seen as geometry triangles locking into one another, forces transferred down into posts and into the earth. This was no longer instinct alone, but a kind of unspoken mathematics, traced in timber rather than ink. Durability brought new dimensions of life. When lashings rotted, a house collapsed, but when joinery held, a frame could last decades. Repairs became possible. A single post replaced, a beam refitted, the skeleton of the house enduring as families grew and generations turned. Over time, such frames acquired character. Smoke darkened their undersides. Oils from hands polished their surfaces. Carvings appeared on exposed beams. The joint, once hidden, became part of memory, a visible testament to the hands that shaped it. There was symbolism here as well. To join two pieces of wood so that they became stronger together than apart resonated with human experience. Marriage, alliance, cooperation all found metaphor in the interlocking of timber. In rituals, posts might be set as witnesses, beams lifted with ceremony, their fastening marking not just construction but commitment. A house thus became not only shelter but covenant, its joints embodying bonds both material and social. Fastenings also shaped interiors. A pegged frame could rise taller and lighter than one held only by mass. This created rooms with greater height, space for lofts or galleries, and rafters that invited decoration. A house could be more than a hut. It could be a hall, a space where light fell differently, where voices echoed, where the scale itself altered the experience of gathering. Without joinery, such interiors would have been impossible. The spread of these techniques was quiet but decisive. In lands with little stone, joinery allowed timber to dominate. In places where stone prevailed, wooden frames still found their way into roofs, doors, and furniture. The vocabulary of joints became part of the universal grammar of building, carried from one region to another, refined, adapted, and reimagined. Even today, echoes of those early mortises and tenons remain in the frames of barns, temples, and houses that stand across continents. Thus, the journey from lashing to joint, from rope to peg, marked more than a technical advance. It signaled a shift toward permanence, precision, and system. With joinery, buildings gained not only strength but character, their frames becoming expressive as well as functional. The house ceased to be a shelter of necessity and began to approach architecture of choice. From here, the path led outward, from individual frames to collective form. Posts, beams, walls, and joints combined to create structures that were not only strong but expressive, shaping the atmosphere within. And as these choices accumulated, they began to influence how people felt about space itself. It was intimate or lofty, fragile or enduring. The story was turning toward shelter with character. The roof and the interior atmosphere it contained preparing for a shift from structural bones to the coverings and comforts that clothed them. A frame of posts and beams, or a wall of stone carefully set, could stand upright, stable, and enduring. Yet structure alone did not make a house. Bones had to be clothed. Lines of weight had to be softened into rooms where voices lingered and sleep felt secure. With each improvement in systems of support, whether the careful balance of dry stone, the patience of corbelling, or the precision of joinery and other horizon opened. What atmosphere should shelter create? What did a family wish to feel when stepping inside, closing the day behind them? The choices made in structure began to answer these questions almost unbidden. A dry stone wall, thick and low, produced interiors that were dim and hushed, their coolness preserved even under summer heat. Post and beam frames, by contrast, opened wider spans, their interiors airy and mutable, with light falling through thin walls of reed or daub. Corbelled chambers created solemn enclosures, their narrowing curves pressing the air downward, as though space itself carried gravity. Each system set a tone, influencing mood and ritual even before decoration was considered. From these tones, shelters gained character. Roofs crowned the structure, dictating not only how rain slid away, but how sound echoed inside. The choice of roofing red, sod, bark, or shingle was not purely practical. It determined how a storm would sound overhead, whether as a muffled hiss through thatch, or as a drumming cascade against wooden shingles. Interiors became defined by these acoustics, shaping memory in subtle ways. To a child, the memory of home might be less of walls and beams than of the particular rhythm of rain on the roof. Structure also suggested scale. Where posts were stout and beams massive, interiors tended toward monumentality, even if modest in size. Visitors felt the strength of the frame, the way uprights grounded into earth like trees, be in lighter structures, with thinner posts and woven walls. The impression was different, fragile perhaps, but also open, allowing sound, air, and light to filter more freely. These contrasts gave communities distinct architectural voices, even when their basic systems were shared. Character emerged in thresholds as well. A beam placed across a doorway could lower the entry, creating a sense of crossing into enclosure. A lintel carved with marks or painted with pigment declared ownership or meaning. Stones laid as sills wore smooth under countless feet, each step inscribing the passage of life. The same structural element that bore weight also bore memory, transforming technical choice into cultural expression. As generations repaired and rebuilt, this character deepened. A peg replaced with a new one, a wall patched where a stone had fallen. Each repair left traces, layering time into the structure. What had begun as engineering slowly became autobiography. A house was no longer just a response to weather and weight. It was a palimpsest of decisions, accidents, and attachments. In its joints and spans, in its patched walls and weathered beams, families read their own histories. This transition from pure necessity to expressive shelter was not dramatic, but gradual. almost imperceptible. It unfolded as quietly as moss thickening on stone, or as beams darkening with smoke. Yet the effect was profound. Homes came to embody identity, carrying a tone of intimacy, stability, or dignity, depending on how they were structured. Even without ornament, the house itself spoke a language of form and proportion, of thickness and span. The path forward now turned to the coverings and interiors that amplified this character. Roofs and insulation transformed structure into comfort, while floors and platforms organized daily life within. Climate demanded ingenuity, and builders responded not only with technical fixes, but with atmospheres. Warmth held in winter, breezes admitted in summer, silence or resonance tuned to local preference. From structure outward, the story was moving toward roofing, insulation, and the shaping of interiors, where the bones of architecture gained their flesh and their breath. A frame of posts and beams, or a wall of stone carefully set, could stand upright, stable, and enduring. Yet structure alone did not make a house. Bones had to be clothed. Lines of weight had to be softened into rooms, where voices lingered and sleep felt secure. With each improvement in systems of support, whether the careful balance of dry stone, the patience of corbelling, or the precision of joinery and the horizon opened. What atmosphere should shelter create? What did a family wish to feel when stepping inside, closing the day behind them? The choices made in structure began to answer these questions almost unbidden. A dry stone wall, thick and low, produced interiors that were dim and hushed, their coolness preserved even under summer heat. Post and beam frames, by contrast, opened wider spans, their interiors airy and mutable, with light falling through thin walls of reed or daub. Corbelled chambers created solemn enclosures, their narrowing curves pressing the air downward, as though space itself carried gravity. Each system set a tone, influencing mood and ritual even before decoration was considered. From these tones, shelters gained character. Roofs crowned the structure, dictating not only how rain slid away, but how sound echoed inside. The choice of roofing red, sod, bark, or shingle was not purely practical. It determined how a storm would sound overhead, whether as a muffled hiss through thatch, or as a drumming cascade against wooden shingles. Interiors became defined by these acoustics, shaping memory in subtle ways. To a child, the memory of home might be less of walls and beams than of the particular rhythm of rain on the roof. Structure also suggested scale. Where posts were stout and beams massive, interiors tended toward monumentality, even if modest in size. Visitors felt the strength of the frame, the way uprights grounded into earth like trees, be in lighter structures, with thinner posts and woven walls. The impression was different, fragile perhaps, but also open, allowing sound, air, and light to filter more freely. These contrasts gave communities distinct architectural voices, even when their basic systems were shared. Character emerged in thresholds as well. A beam placed across a doorway could lower the entry, creating a sense of crossing into enclosure. A lintel carved with marks or painted with pigment declared ownership or meaning. Stones laid as sills wore smooth under countless feet, each step inscribing the passage of life. The same structural element that bore weight also bore memory, transforming technical choice into cultural expression. As generations repaired and rebuilt, this character deepened. A peg replaced with a new one, a wall patched where a stone had fallen. Each repair left traces, layering time into the structure. What had begun as engineering slowly became autobiography. A house was no longer just a response to weather and weight. It was a palimpsest of decisions, accidents, and attachments. In its joints and spans, in its patched walls and weathered beams, families read their own histories. This transition from pure necessity to expressive shelter was not dramatic, but gradual, almost imperceptible. It unfolded as quietly as moss thickening on stone, or as beams darkening with smoke. Yet the effect was profound. Homes came to embody identity, carrying a tone of intimacy, stability, or dignity, depending on how they were structured. Even without ornament, the house itself spoke a language of form and proportion, of thickness and span. The path forward now turned to the coverings and interiors that amplified this character. Roofs and insulation transformed structure into comfort, while floors and platforms organized daily life within. Climate demanded ingenuity, and builders responded not only with technical fixes, but with atmospheres. Warmth held in winter, breezes admitted in summer, silence or resonance tuned to local preference. From structure outward, the story was moving toward roofing, insulation, and the shaping of interiors, where the bones of architecture gained their flesh and their breath. Beneath every thatch or sod covering lay a secret skeleton of wood. If the roof was the crown, timber frames were the sinews that held its shape, quietly directing how rainwater slid away, how snow pressed downward, and how air moved inside. In their arrangement, beams and rafters became more than hidden supports. They determined whether a room felt expansive or cramped, orderly or precarious, secure or fragile. The unseen geometry above a family's head-shaped daily life, as surely as the food stored in jars or the fire tended at night. The simplest frames were little more than poles leaned against one another, bound at the top and spread at the base like inverted triangles. Such A-frames suited the needs of nomadic or semi-settled groups, easily raised, easily abandoned. But when families lingered in one place, and walls grew stronger, a more elaborate language of timber emerged. Posts set within the house supported beams running the length of the structure. Across these beams, rafters were laid, angled downward toward the eaves. In this way, the roof's burden was carried not by walls alone, but by an interior rhythm of wood. Geometry became a quiet ally. Builders discovered that a triangle could not be deformed without breaking, while a square twisted at the slightest pressure. From this insight came trusses, triangular units of timber pegged and tied, that spanned wide spaces without sagging. Trusses allowed roofs to extend beyond the narrow circle of a hearth, opening rooms that could host larger gatherings, accommodate storage lofts, or divide into multiple areas of daily use. The house became less a single enclosure and more a stage of varied activity, organized beneath the invisible discipline of triangles. Every timber frame carried traces of the tools and hands that shaped it. Mortises were cut into beams, tenons whittled to fit them snugly, pegs driven through to hold the union. Each joint was a moment of decision, requiring precision and care. A poorly cut slot might split the beam, undoing days of labor. Yet when the fit was true, wood locked into wood with a permanence that required no metal nails. These connections had their own acoustics, a faint creak under strain, the muffled thud of a peg driven home, the silence of a joint that held firm. Families living beneath such roofs carried these sounds in memory, though they may never have seen the joints themselves. The arrangement of timbers also influenced the feel of interior. Low rafters pressed the air down, creating spaces of intimacy, where smoke drifted slowly and voices carried close. High-pitched roofs lifted sound upward, dispersing it, creating a sense of openness even in modest rooms. In some houses, rafters were left visible, darkening with soot, each beam recording the passage of years in its grain. Children stared upward at those beams, learning their patterns as naturally as constellations, tracing them in idle moments before sleep. As houses grew in number and neighbors clustered close, roofing frames began to carry symbolic as well as practical weight. The raising of a roof was no small event. It required many hands to lift the long beams into place, to balance them while joints were fixed and bindings tied. These were communal acts, remembered as much for the shared labor as for the finished shelter. To stand beneath a newly raised roof was to feel, for a moment, that human effort could rival storm and season. The frame became not just structure, but testament to cooperation. Different regions expressed this timber language in distinct dialects. In forested valleys, rafters were long, slender, and plentiful, spanning rooms with ease. On plains where wood was scarce, beams were thick, short, and precious, their arrangement compact. In coastal settlements, driftwood became a resource, twisted by sea, but serviceable when straightened and shaped. In each case, geometry adapted to ecology, but the underlying principles remained constant. Triangles for strength, joints for permanence, rhythm for order. Over time, roofing frames acquired a subtle aesthetic dimension. The spacing of rafters created patterns of shadow. The pitch of a roof determined how a house appeared from the lane. A steep roof, thatched thickly, suggested abundance, perhaps even pride. A flatter roof, sod-clad, seemed to merge into the earth, modest and grounded. Even without carved ornament, these differences carried meaning. They whispered of how a community regarded itself, whether it wished to rise sharply above the fields or fold quietly back into them. Thus timber roofing frames transformed shelter into architecture. They allowed rooms to be scaled larger, ceilings to be lifted higher, and interiors to be given tone. Beneath their span, daily life unfolded with new possibilities, gatherings, storage, division of labor, privacy, and ritual. The roof was no longer a mere lid against the sky, but a designed canopy, a crafted horizon within which families enacted the cycles of their lives. From these frames, the gaze naturally fell downward. If timbers gave shape overhead, what of the ground underfoot? A floor was not merely the earth one walked on, but a surface deliberately made, raised, leveled, hardened, or softened. The story of shelter now moved from crowns and bones to bases and platforms, where choices of flooring organized the rhythms of sleeping, eating, and storing. The interior, once only enclosed, was beginning to be orchestrated. When a roof was raised and walls stood firm, the final boundary of a house was not above or around, but beneath. The floor was where daily life unfolded, the ground of every step, the stage for every act of work, rest, or intimacy. It was the first surface a newborn touched, and the last upon which the old sat, listening to voices that would outlive them. Yet the floor was not inevitable. Left untended, it was the same earth as outside, uneven, dusty, damp with rain, rutted by feet. The transformation of raw ground into a deliberate surface was as profound as raising walls or laying roofs. It turned enclosure into interior. The earliest floors were little more than cleared soil, leveled with effort and tamped by feet until hard. Over time, families learned that packing earth with gravel, ash, or crushed shell created a firmer, more even plane. Ash, in particular, swept from hearths, hardened ground when mixed with water. What might otherwise be waste became a subtle form of improvement. With each season's sweeping and stamping, the floor acquired a sheen, as if polished by time itself. Such surfaces were humble but effective, durable enough for daily life, soft enough to accept the rhythm of bare souls. Raised platforms introduced another dimension. In colder climates, a low wooden stage offered relief from dampness and draught. The platform's boards, hewn from timber, formed a clean, dry plain above the soil. Families sat and slept upon it, while goods were stored beneath, safe from moisture or rodents. The slight elevation created a psychological as well as practical boundary. To step up was to enter a space of rest, to leave the dust and labor of the floor below. Children grew up with a sense that the house itself had levels of intimacy, that one did not sprawl on the earth when retreat was possible to a higher, protected place. Not all platforms were of wood. In treeless regions, people formed sleeping benches from packed clay, stone slabs, or woven mats lifted on frames of reed. Some were coated with plaster, smoothed until cool to the touch, a surface both functional and pleasant. In houses where hearths were central, platforms were often arranged around them, creating communal rings of warmth. Night after night, families stretched upon these stages, their bodies aligning with the geometry of firelight. The floor was no longer neutral but choreographed, directing where people sat, where they worked, where they lay down to dream. Floors also became archives of use. Each layer of occupation left traces, ashes trampled flat, fibers dropped from weaving, husks scattered from meals. Archaeologists, centuries later, would read these layers like chapters, peeling back time with each scrape of the trowel. But in their own moment, families experienced the floor not as record, but as presence moved each morning, renewed by sweeping, remade by habit. The act of sweeping was itself ritual, a gesture that maintained order, turning a simple surface into the symbol of a kept house. As communities grew denser, flooring took on social as well as domestic weight. Pathways of compacted earth wound between thresholds. Alleys carried the imprint of countless feet. Within houses, the quality of flooring could mark distinction. Some families invested labor in smoothing, plastering, even painting their floors with pigments of red or white. Others were content with bare soil. A visitor crossing from one threshold to another felt the difference underfoot. The floor spoke quietly but unmistakably of the household's standing and its care for detail. Materials brought their own atmospheres. Wooden planks creaked faintly, echoing movement across a room. Clay floors were silent, cool in summer and chill in winter. Red mats, laid thickly, offered spring and fragrance, their texture catching the light. In each case, the sensory qualities of flooring shaped memory. A child lying awake might remember the faint scent of dried rushes, the smoothness of plaster beneath their palm, or the soft murmur of boards under their mother's tread. The floor was felt as much as seen. Platforms in particular created new rhythms of life. To store grain beneath was to turn space into resource. To sleep above was to mark a separation between the body and the earth. These raised surfaces hinted at ideas that would later define architecture, that levels could organize activity, that height could signal importance, that the arrangement of surfaces was as meaningful as their material. The humble act of raising a bed from soil to stage carried within it the seeds of hierarchy, of room differentiation, of architecture as spatial order. The symbolic dimension of floors cannot be overlooked. To kneel upon a packed earthen surface was to acknowledge continuity with the land. To step onto a plastered, whitened floor was to cross into a crafted world, where human hands had remade the earth into something new. Floors defined thresholds as surely as doors did. They marked the passage from outside to inside, from public to private, from profane to protected. To sit cross-legged on the floor with others was to participate in equality. To recline on a raised platform was to suggest privilege. These nuances, unspoken but deeply felt, gave the ground beneath a social texture as intricate as its material one. With floors and platforms, interiors began to feel not only enclosed but organized. The space beneath the roof was no longer a single, undifferentiated volume. It had levels, zones, rhythms. It directed bodies into patterns of rest, work, and ritual. And from here, the next challenge naturally followed. Not how people met the ground, but how they managed the air. Houses had to deal with heat and cold, with air that stagnated or fled, with climates that varied wildly. Architecture's story thus turned to the management of climate without reliance on central hearths or chimneys, to the subtle ways walls, roofs, and openings modulated comfort before true fireplaces were made the heart of the home. A roof could shed rain, and a floor could steady the feet, but between them lingered air, fickle, shifting, the most difficult element to master. In every house, climate was the unseen inhabitant, pressing against walls, seeping through gaps, dictating whether nights were endurable or bitter. Before chimneys, before stoves, before the deliberate circulation of air, families relied on the quiet intelligence of design. They placed openings carefully, angled roofs, widened or narrowed eaves, and oriented entire houses to the path of sun and wind. Comfort, in those days, was an art of anticipation. Orientation came first. To turn a doorway toward the morning sun was to invite warmth into the house after the chill of night. To face walls against the prevailing winds was to reduce draughts, sparing the family from endless gusts sweeping through their rooms. The siting of houses already took slope and drainage into account. Now it also balanced warmth and breeze, weighing which direction would bring relief in summer without surrendering to cold in winter. A simple choice of axis could mean the difference between a home that embraced the season and one that endured it reluctantly. Eaves carried similar wisdom. By extending the line of a roof outward, builders created shaded zones in summer when the high sun blazed directly overhead. Those same eaves in winter admitted the lower light, its rays penetrating deeper into interiors and warming earthen floors. The eave was not merely a protection against rain. It was a timekeeper tuned to the cycle of solstice and equinox, helping the house to breathe with the year, to sit in the cool shade beneath a wide summer eve, or to bask in a narrow beam of winter sunlight angled through the doorway, was to feel that the building itself was in dialogue with the sky. Ventilation was achieved with equal subtlety. Smoke holes at the crown of a roof, designed originally to release the fumes of a hearth, doubled as vents, drawing stale air upward. Small openings cut low in walls admitted fresh breezes, and the natural convection between low intake and high outlet created circulation without devices. In warm climates, entire walls of woven reed or lattice allowed air to pass freely, while in colder lands, shutters or mats sealed those same apertures when night fell. The control of air was never absolute, but it was adaptive, an architecture of adjustment rather than domination. Insulation, too, came from humble sources. Thick turf walls, daub packed with straw, even layers of animal hides stretched across openings served to hold warmth where it was scarce. Builders observed how earth retained temperature, and they extended this principle above ground. Walls of mass absorbed heat by day and released it slowly by night. Families may not have spoken in terms of thermal mass or conduction, yet their choices revealed an intuitive grasp of physics honed by generations of experiment. Each surface, each layer, each material was a tool in the management of climate. Comfort was not constant but cyclical, binned. In summer, the cool interior of a pit house was treasured, even if it meant dampness lingered. In winter, the same damp chill became burden, and fires had to be stoked more often. Families accepted such compromises. They did not expect perfect balance, but they learned to tune their habits to their shelters, to sit near openings when breezes were kind, to huddle closer when drafts grew unkind, to mark the house as a living companion rather than a fixed refuge. The house was not flawless, but it was faithful. These strategies also shaped the rhythm of daily life. Work often moved outdoors during temperate hours, returning indoors only when heat or cold pressed too strongly. Narrow lanes between houses became extensions of climate management, their shaded walls cooling the air, their orientation channeling breezes. Courtyards provided light and ventilation to interior rooms, their voids acting as lungs for the house. Press, even in the absence of chimneys or stoves, a settlement as a whole became a system for moderating air and temperature, each structure contributing to the comfort of the other. What might seem primitive to later eyes carried sophistication. To design without relying on centralized heat was to design with nuance, to read the path of sun across a hillside, to know how high a wall should rise before it blocked a breeze, to cut openings at just the height where they would draw smoke but not let in rain. These were not errors waiting to be corrected by later invention, but achievements in themselves. They offered comfort at little cost, using no fuel beyond what was already needed for cooking. They aligned architecture with ecology, tethering human life to natural cycles instead of breaking free from them. And within these choices lay culture, a house oriented to the sunrise framed each morning as ritual. A roof vent admitting stars alongside smoke turned the night sky into a ceiling. A shaded courtyard became not only a cooler space, but a gathering place, where social bonds intertwined with climate management. Comfort was not a technical problem to be solved, but a way of living, where architecture, weather, and habit formed a single fabric. Thus, before chimneys and fireplaces reshaped interiors into zones of focused heat, homes already breathed with intelligence. They caught the sun when it was kind, deflected it when harsh. They admitted air when needed, denied it when cruel. They stored warmth in their walls and released it gently in the cold hours before dawn. Comfort was less controlled, more seasonal, yet it carried a rhythm that harmonized with the land. Pry from these lessons in climate, attention naturally widened. A house was never isolated. It stood beside others, sharing walls, casting shadows, aligning doorways, forming paths. As families multiplied, the management of space extended beyond interiors into streets, courtyards, and neighborhoods. What had begun as the shaping of a single room now expanded into the choreography of many lives together. By the time families learned to tame climate with eaves, vents, and walls of mass, the house had grown into something more than a solitary enclosure. No dwelling ever stood completely alone. Even the most isolated huts left traces of paths trodden toward water, firewood, or neighboring kin. Where many houses gathered, The boundaries between one shelter and the next became as significant as the walls themselves. Architecture, having begun with the earth beneath and the roofs above, now pressed outward toward streets, courtyards, and the modest civic structures that stitched households into communities. Shared walls marked the first step. When houses pressed close for protection against weather or for economy of effort, the line dividing one family's hearth from another's became thin, often little more than daub or timber. The warmth of one fire passed faintly through. The murmur of voices seeped across. Privacy was relative, yet solidarity was strong. To build side by side meant to acknowledge dependence. If your neighbor's wall failed, your own would bear the strain. Repair became a shared duty, the sound of hammering or the sight of scaffolding familiar in every season. The spaces between houses also demanded attention. Lanes formed naturally, beaten by feet, widened where neighbors greeted one another, narrowed where walls closed in. These lanes were not designed with surveyor's tools, yet they carried logic. They sought the shortest path to water, the easiest slope to climb, the most sheltered route through wind. At night, when fires burned low and shadows stretched long, the feel of these lanes determined whether the settlement seemed inviting or ominous. A well-placed threshold, a narrow passage suddenly opening into a broader court, gave rhythm to the experience of moving through a village. Thresholds themselves became quiet theaters of community. To linger at a doorway was to participate in daily exchange, neither fully inside nor fully outside. Children perched there, watching games spill into the lane. Elders sat with tools or baskets, greeting passers-by. The architecture of transition low sills, shaded overhangs, the simple gesture of a stone step was as important to social life as the hearth within. The house, in this sense, projected outward, making its first contribution to the civic fabric. As homes multiplied, attention shifted to how their collective presence shaped climate and comfort. Shared walls conserved heat, alleys funneled breezes, clusters of buildings created sheltered pockets. What had once been achieved by the angle of a roof or the placement of a vent now extended into larger scales. The placement of entire dwellings in relation to one another. A neighborhood was, in effect, a kind of climate management in its own right, balancing shade and sun, openness and enclosure. Over time, families began to imagine spaces that were not merely the sum of private homes. Courtyards opened in the hearts of clusters, offering areas for work, feasting, or ritual beyond the confines of any single family. Workshops occupied shared corners, their rhythms audible to all. These were the beginnings of civic architecture, born not of monumental intention, but of the simple recognition that some activities grinding grain, tanning hides, storing harvest, were better done together. Repair also tied these clusters into memory. A cracked wall patched with borrowed stone, a sagging roof propped by a neighbor's timber, a shared trench dug to redirect rainwater, all became stories carried forward, reminders that no house stood entirely on its own. Over years and generations, neighborhoods developed characters distinct from one another, as if each cluster of homes had its own personality, shaped by the choices of those who repaired, aligned, and adapted them. The house, once a response to slope and soil, had thus become a participant in a greater pattern. It stood not only against the sky, but in relation to others, each wall, roof, and path, part of a fabric larger than itself. Architecture was becoming civic, even before temples or palaces declared themselves in stone. The quiet decisions of householders, the placement of a threshold, the angle of a roof, the line of a laneway, laying the groundwork for streets, neighborhoods, and long-lived spaces. From here, the narrative expands outward still further. If the floor marked the intimacy of family life, and the roof crowned a single home, then the lane and the courtyard began to speak of community. The story was now turning toward the architecture of many households together, how streets shaped movement, how courtyards became workshops, how tombs and stones embodied memory. The fabric of shelter was stretching, preparing to hold not only individuals, but the life of settlements themselves. But when houses pressed against one another, narrow lanes appeared almost by accident. A wall traced its edge here, a roof's drippling insisted on clearance there, and the empty space that remained became a path. These lanes were rarely straight. They curved with the contours of terrain, with the stubborn roots of old trees, and with the social rhythms of neighbors who preferred closeness in some places and distance in others. What emerged was neither blueprint nor grid, but something organic, arteries of movement where footsteps wore the earth smooth. The experience of a lane was measured not only in length, but in sensation. Underfoot, the ground was packed hard by generations of feet, rutted where water pooled, soft where new earth had been laid after a repair. Alongside, walls rose unevenly, some freshly plastered, others weathered and chipped. At certain bends, light spilled suddenly into view, warming the stone or timber. In others, shade held, heavy and cool, accompanied by the faint smell of damp earth. These textures gave lanes their mood, their character. Walking them was a daily reminder that shelter was not confined to walls alone. It extended into the very spaces between. Thresholds broke the rhythm of walls, small openings that became markers of life within. They offered glimpses, flickers of firelight, the hum of a family's work, the smell of food being prepared. Each doorway was more than an entrance. It was a stage on which the negotiation between private and public life unfolded. To step across a threshold was to shift status, leaving behind the collective gaze of the lane for the intimacy of hearth and roof. Yet the threshold also projected outward, a place where one might linger to share news, to rest with a basket, to exchange goods or greetings without fully inviting another inside. Some thresholds became more pronounced than others. A single stone set firmly at the sill created a pause before entry, a ritual in miniature. Raised steps hinted at a household that wished to hold its boundary firm, requiring effort to cross. Overhangs offered shade to the entry, signaling welcome or simply providing comfort to those waiting outside. even without carved symbols or inscriptions. These details spoke volumes about how a household saw itself in relation to the community. Night lent these lanes and thresholds an entirely different life. Without the glare of lamps or torches at every corner, the darkness was deep. A doorway lit by fire within cast long, angular shadows, turning thresholds into beacons, both protective and mysterious. Footsteps echoed differently in the stillness, and narrow passages could feel either intimate or foreboding depending on the company one kept. Settlements, at such hours, became mazes of memory and trust. One walked not merely by sight, but by knowledge of where each turn lead, which doors might open in need, and which lanes were better avoided until daylight. Over generations, these patterns hardened into structure. The placement of thresholds influenced the flow of lanes. Lanes, in turn, guided how new houses aligned themselves. Settlement planning, though unmarked by official design, carried coherence born of repetition and habit. The house no longer ended at its walls. Its threshold projected into the lane, and the lane braided thresholds together into a living fabric of movement and exchange. Thus, the modest gestures of sighting and entry became the first true urban design. They were not monumental, yet they were profound. For in the shape of a lane and the position of a threshold lay the blueprint of community. How people passed each other, how they shared words and silences, how they balanced the need for privacy with the inevitability of connection. The architecture of the street had arrived, not as an invention, but as the quiet consequence of life lived side by side. Beyond the lanes and thresholds, another kind of space emerged at the heart of clusters of homes. The courtyard. Unlike the lane, which belonged to all who passed, the courtyard was shaped by those who bordered it. It was both shared and intimate, a common pocket where daily life spilled outward from doorways. Courtyards rarely announced themselves with grand walls or markers. They were simply open ground enclosed by dwellings, the void left between roofs. Yet in this emptiness, life thickened. By day, courtyards carried the sound of labor. Grain was pounded in hollowed stones, the steady rhythm echoing between walls. Clay vessels were laid in the sun to dry, their pale bodies catching the light. Textiles, stretched across frames, rippled faintly in the breeze as nimble hands tied or combed threads. Children darted in and out, playing games among tools and baskets, their shrieks mingling with the thud of work. It was in courtyards that the pulse of settlement was most tangible, less a chorus than an overlapping murmur of tasks and voices. The courtyard was also the kitchen beyond the house. Fires kindled in open air left fewer scars on interior walls and allowed smoke to drift away. The smell of roasting grain or simmering broth was shared across households, each family's pot contributing to a mingled atmosphere of sustenance. Cooking here was a performance visible to neighbors, binding them together in the exchange of taste, of borrowed spices, of shared utensils when one was lacking. Domestic life, while rooted in private interiors, leaned heavily on these collective hearths. Workshops grew from this rhythm, where one family proved skilled in shaping stone, others came to barter, or learn. Where weaving frames multiplied, courtyards became textile halls, threads strung in many directions at once. Skills aggregated in these open pockets, and with them came specialization. A settlement was not a scatter of identical homes, but a web of courtyards, each with its own reputation. Here the potters, there the weavers, elsewhere the workers in bone or shell. Without formal markets or guilds, these clusters performed much the same function, concentrating knowledge and distributing its fruits. The courtyard was not all work. It was also a stage for ritual, for gathering, for play. Seasonal feasts began here, with benches or mats arranged in circles, food laid out on broad platters, and songs echoing against the walls. Storytelling, too, belonged to these spaces, especially in twilight when tasks slowed and firelight replaced the sun. The boundaries of family blurred in such moments. The courtyard drew together those who shared a wall and, by extension, the lives attached to it. Repair often began in these same places. Stones were piled, timber trimmed, mud prepared for plastering. When one household patched a roof or reset a post, others lent tools or hands. Courtyards became workshops for the settlement itself, where the architecture of maintenance unfolded. Each repair bore the memory of collective effort, so that over time these spaces held not only the marks of labor, but the echoes of cooperation. Even the ground underfoot told its story. Layers of ash, sherds of broken pottery, fragments of tools, and the occasional lost bead pressed into the soil. Each generation trampled its traces, and yet, year by year, the courtyard floor thickened with history. Archaeologists uncovering these layers, millennia later, would find not monuments, but the small evidence of daily continuity. A grindstone worn smooth, a post hole filled with ash, a child's discarded toy. In their accumulation lay the biography of ordinary life. In this way, the courtyard was both practical and symbolic. It was the lung of the household cluster, drawing people together and sustaining their rhythm. It was the archive of labor and the theater of celebration. Most importantly, it was proof that architecture was never only about walls and roofs. It was equally about the spaces left open between them. From courtyards, the settlement extended its logic outward, just as thresholds gave lanes their texture, and lanes guided movement. So too did courtyards anchor, clusters of families and workshops. Together they formed the rudiments of neighborhoods, each with its own tone, its own economy of skill, its own cadence of work and rest. What had begun as shelter from weather was now shaping the pattern of social life itself. No building, however carefully sited or sturdily made, could escape the steady erosion of time. Roofs sagged under the weight of wet thatch. Posts softened where earth met wood. Walls cracked as seasons pulled them in opposite directions. In settlements without masons, guilds, or monumental masons, repair was not a specialized craft, but a rhythm woven into life. To live in a house meant, inevitably, to tend it. Each patch, each mended joint, each fresh layer of plaster marked not only the survival of a structure, but the persistence of those within it. Repair was rarely invisible. A new stone stood out from older ones by its sharper edge or lighter tone. A section of wall, newly coated in mud, shone darker until sun bleached it. Roofs rethatched gleamed golden for a season before weather dulled them. These contrasts were not flaws, but signatures, visible reminders that a house had endured, that it had met weather, accident, or simple passage of time, and been renewed. For neighbors walking the lanes, the patchwork of repair was legible history. The act itself carried a certain ceremony. A sagging roof required a ladder, which neighbors might steady. Mud plaster mixed for wall repairs was too heavy for one person to carry alone. So children joined in, running buckets back and forth. When a foundation stone had shifted, men and women together strained to lever it back into place. Each effort left not only a stronger building, but a memory of hands joined. Over years, families told stories not only of who built a house, but of who repaired it, and when, and under what circumstances. Architecture became a palimpsest of human continuity. In some cases, repairs accumulated into transformation. A house begun as a shallow pit shelter might, after successive rebuilds, stand proudly on raised foundations. A timber wall, patched again and again, might finally be replaced with stone, the line of repair blurring into a shift of material. In this way, adaptation was carried forward not as sudden invention, but as slow accretion. Each repair was an experiment. Each experiment that endured became tradition. The very materials bore these cycles of renewal. Thatch stripped from a roof could be repurposed as animal bedding or mulch for gardens. Stones from a collapsed wall found new life in a hearth or threshold. Broken pottery swept into courtyards, sometimes mixed with clay for new plaster, giving strength from fragments. Nothing was wasted if it could serve again, and in this reuse, the memory of earlier structures lingered. A wall might stand built of stones that once marked another family's dwelling, another life. The settlement became a layered archive of past and present, stitched together by necessity and care. For children growing up within these environments, repair was education. They learned to judge timber by its sound, to recognize when a wall had shifted, to understand that shelter was not permanent, but earned through maintenance. The knowledge was practical, but it also shaped perspective. Permanence was not given, only constructed again and again. The idea of home was inseparable from the effort to sustain it. This rhythm of tending also gave settlements a particular atmosphere. Unlike the clean lines of later monumental architecture, early neighborhoods bore a patchwork look. Fresh plaster alongside cracked, roofs half bright and half weathered, posts dark with age beside newly cut timber. To modern eyes it might seem disorderly, yet for those who lived among it, this texture carried comfort. It was proof of resilience, evidence that time had passed, and yet life endured. Each repair spoke of continuity in the face of decay. Memory, too, settled into these acts. A patched wall might recall the flood that once swept through. A reinforced roof might evoke the storm that had torn others apart. A hearthstone, chipped and reset, could remind a family of the fire that had nearly escaped control. Repair was not only physical but narrative, binding generations with stories inscribed in architecture itself. To enter such a house was to walk into a chronicle written in wood and stone. Thus, repair was more than maintenance. It was memory given form, the material history of lives lived in close quarters with weather, time, and one another. Through each patch and reinforcement, a house became a witness. And as settlements grew, these collective acts of preservation shaped not only the endurance of buildings, but the shared memory of communities. To look upon a neighborhood was to see a fabric of repairs, some fresh, some ancient teach, one a quiet affirmation that life, however fragile, had been kept going. From these rhythms of care, another impulse slowly gathered strength, the desire not merely to patch and endure, but to mark permanence more deliberately, where repairs accumulated endlessly. Some communities began to ask whether stone might serve not just for walls and hearths, but for monument structures meant to last beyond repair, beyond even the life of those who built them. And so, from patchwork homes and courtyards, the path turned toward more enduring gestures, tombs, megaliths, and communal spaces that spoke not of daily repair, but of collective memory set in stone. When daily houses bore their patchwork of repairs, and courtyards rang with the sound of work, a quieter ambition was taking shape at the edges of settlements. People began to build not only for shelter, but for permanence, for memory that outlived their own footsteps. These were not the houses of the living, but the stones of the dead, the markers of seasons, the communal places where meaning was set in earth and rock. Out of modest timber and plastered walls arose the impulse for monumental gestures. The first of these were tombs. A simple pit in the ground might hold the remains of one life. But soon families wished to mark the site, to make it known and durable. Stones were piled, slabs set upright, chambers formed beneath the soil. In some places, long mounds stretched across the landscape, sheltering generations beneath their ridges. To walk among them was to walk in the company of ancestors, each stone a reminder that life was brief, but memory could be anchored in earth. Elsewhere, stones stood upright in careful lines or circles. Their purpose has long been debated: markers of seasons, calendars of sun and moon, gathering places for ritual. Whatever their function, their presence spoke of coordination, of collective labor beyond the needs of any single household. To quarry, drag, and set such stones required hands from many families, and thus the monument itself became a record of cooperation. Each alignment of stone was as much about community as about cosmos. The scale of these gestures distinguished them from repair. Where repair was humble, patching what time had worn, the monument declared itself against time altogether. A standing stone might outlast countless roofs, countless generations of repair, its surface weathering, but its presence enduring. In a world of fragile materials, thatch, timber, mudstone alone offered the illusion of permanence. Communities turned to it when they wished to express continuity, not just of a house or a family, but of a people. Yet these monuments were not isolated from daily life. They rose within the same landscapes where homes and courtyards clustered. Children played round their bases. Farmers passed them on the way to fields. The extraordinary was embedded within the ordinary, just as the lane threaded past thresholds and courtyards. A tomb mound on the horizon, or a stone circle in a meadow was not a distant shrine, but a presence woven into routine. The monumental and the domestic were companions, not opposites. Monumental gestures also changed how communities imagined space, where houses faced inward, enclosing courtyards and hearths. Monuments faced outward, addressing the horizon, the sun, the sky. They were less about shelter and more about orientation, helping people place themselves in time and in the greater order of things. Standing stones cast long shadows that marked the hours. Tombs aligned with celestial events turned death into part of a cosmic cycle. Architecture had expanded from the needs of the body to the needs of memory and meaning. The labor of building these structures was itself a kind of ritual. 2 whole stones required coordinated effort, ropes pulling in rhythm, sledges creaking, songs or chants setting the pace. Those who worked together forged bonds beyond kinship, bonds rooted in shared accomplishment. When the stone finally rose into place, the moment carried not only spiritual significance, but communal pride. A settlement that could raise such monuments declared itself capable of shaping its world, of leaving a mark visible across valleys and centuries. These gestures, in turn, reinforced identity. To gather in a circle of stones, or to bury the dead beneath a great mound, was to participate in a story larger than one household. The settlement became more than a cluster of homes. It became a community with memory, with rituals, with visible proof of its cohesion. The stones testified to continuity in a way fragile houses could not. Even when roofs collapsed and walls crumbled, the monuments remained, tethering new generations to old. Thus, the monumental was not an abandonment of the domestic, but an extension of its logic. Repair had taught families that buildings carried memory. Monuments took this lesson further, making memory durable beyond repair. Courtyards had drawn households together. Stone circles drew whole communities. In both, architecture spoke not only of function, but of relationship between living and dead, between earth and sky, between the present moment and the long arc of time. And so, by the close of this chapter, the settlement had become layered. Lanes guided feet, thresholds marked intimacy, courtyards pulsed with labor, repairs stitched memory, and monuments stood as anchors of permanence. From slope and soil to stone and circle, architecture had unfolded not as a sudden invention, but as a long, quiet conversation between shelter and meaning. It was a conversation still gathering force, preparing the ground for the ways later cities would order water, storage, and exchange. From the first shallow pits scraped into earth to the massive stones raised toward the horizon, architecture in its earliest forms unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet always with consequence. It began with choice where to place a dwelling, how to angle it toward sun or shield it from prevailing wind. It continued with materials close at hand, the timber of nearby forests, the turf of open plains, the stone that waited in riverbeds or along hillsides. Each decision, modest in itself, gathered into a larger story of human presence on the landscape. The house, at its root, was never only a roof above. It was a floor pressed firm against damp soil, walls stitched together from wood or packed earth, roofs layered with sod or reeds. In these simple structures lay the beginnings of permanence, the notion that human beings might shape their surroundings into something more than temporary shelter. Yet permanence was always tempered by time. Roofs needed thatching anew, posts needed replacing, walls needed patching. Repair became the thread that stitched continuity across generations, teaching that stability was not a gift but a labor repeated. As shelters multiplied, the spaces between them demanded their own architecture. Lanes twisted between walls, thresholds carried the pulse of exchange, courtyards hummed with work and laughter. These voids, shaped less by intention than by daily rhythm, became the true fabric of settlement. A community was as much its passages and meeting places as its roofs and walls. In these in-between spaces, life thickened, weaving individuals into neighbors and neighbors into collective memory. Repair, in its humble way, revealed that memory could reside in buildings as well as in minds. A patch on a wall told of storms endured. A stone reused whispered of lives before. Architecture, even when fragile, was layered with meaning beyond utility. It was a ledger of effort and survival, written in plaster and timber. The turn to monuments marked another kind of ambition, where repair affirmed continuity within the span of one or two generations. Standing stones and tomb mounds reached for permanence that might outlast countless lives. They were not replacements for homes, but companions to them, symbols that communities could see across valleys and measure against the sun. In them, the needs of shelter gave way to the needs of memory and orientation, tying the daily round of work and rest to cycles of death, season, and sky. Looking back, it is clear that these first gestures of architecture were not isolated steps, but a continuum. Each choice the site of a house, the method of spanning space. The act of repair prepared the ground for what followed. Lanes prepared for streets, courtyards prepared for marketplaces, tombs prepared for temples. There was no clean boundary between the domestic and the civic, between shelter and monument. They grew from the same soil, from the same impulse to bind fleeting human life into forms that might endure. Looking ahead, the techniques of stone and timber, the lessons of climate and repair, would become the foundation upon which cities were raised. Later generations would carve canals to direct water, build granaries to store harvest, raise walls to enclose and defend. But the essence of architecture, its negotiation between necessity and memory, between individual need and communal rhythm, was already present in these early shelters. And so the story of architecture's gentle rise concludes not with a grand hall or a palace, but with a neighborhood alive with modest gestures, thresholds polished by feet, courtyards thick with sound, monuments standing quietly beyond. It is a story less about invention than about accumulation, less about sudden genius than about countless hands adjusting, patching and aligning until habit became tradition. In these first houses and first neighborhoods, humanity found more than shelter. It found a way to root memory in earth and stone, to stitch community into space, and to leave traces that would speak even when voices were gone. If the story has seemed calm, it is because architecture itself, in its earliest forms, was a calm companion, unassuming, persistent, and always present. As the listener drifts into rest, let the picture linger. A lane at twilight, its packed earth cool beneath bare feet thresholds. Glowing with firelight, the sound of work fading in a courtyard, and beyond the village a stone set upright against the sky. These were the beginnings of built life, fragile yet enduring, simple yet profound. Play from them rose the cities and monuments to come. But here, at the quiet dawn of architecture, humanity first learned to live not only with shelter, but within memory. We have walked slowly through the beginnings of architecture, from the first careful choice of where to set a floor, to the monumental gestures of stone that watched over whole communities. Each stage was modest in its moment, yet together they formed the quiet foundations of human settlement. Houses rose, fell, and rose again. Courtyards filled with voices. Walls carried scars of repairs. Stones held memory against the sky. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was sudden. It was a long, steady weaving of human need into shape and structure. As the rhythm of this story softens, you might picture the settlement at rest. The lanes empty, the air cooled, thresholds closed, courtyards quiet except for the fading warmth of fire. A roof of reeds sighs faintly in the breeze. Shadows lie across patched walls, and the tall stone at the edge of the village casts its long, silent presence. Nothing here demands urgency. Time is unhurried, and the shelter of night is more complete than any roof. In this calm architecture itself seems to sleep. Posts and beams, stone and earth, all hold their places in the stillness. They have carried weight, they have endured weather, and now they rest as the people inside them rest. The memory they keep will wait until morning, and the repairs, the labors, the work of hands can wait as well. Tonight, only silence fills the rooms and lanes. As the story draws to a close, let the image settle gently. A home of wood and earth, a courtyard touched with ash, a stone standing watch. These were the earliest companions of human life, steady and enduring, their quiet presence shaping days and nights alike. They remind us that shelter has always been more than walls, that it is comfort, memory, and continuity. Let that sense of continuity carry you now, as the narrative itself fades into stillness. Close the door of the lane, cross the threshold of rest, and step into sleep, as if into a house built just for you.